In this video, we will be replacing the passenger side exhaust manifold in this 2012 Ford F150. To prep this vehicle, I have installed wheel chocks behind the rear tires. I have set the parking brake. I have disconnected the negative battery terminal and covered up that cable just so it doesn't accidentally touch anything. I have raised the front of the vehicle and supported it with a variety of safety stands, and I have removed the passenger side wheel. Our first objective is to remove the front inner wheel fender liner. This will give us better access inside the engine where we will be working at, and we can remove those mud guards. And with that removed, we now have access to a couple additional 5.5mm screws. And taking a look up underneath the wheel well, I do see a couple clips for wiring harnesses. These are holding wiring harnesses on the other side. So we're going to go ahead and use a standard head screwdriver to push these through so they don't get hung up on removing this. And we will make an attempt to remove that at this point. Our next objective is to drain the cooling system. So we're going to slowly open the coolant reservoir. Now your engine needs to be cold when you do this, or you could spray hot scalding coolant all over you. Through the passenger side wheel well, we want to locate the petcock for the radiator. This is identified as a small red knob, and there's a small spigot below it, and this is kind of hidden by one of those AC lines. And I'm going to feed on a length of hose to that spigot, and rotating that counterclockwise will open that up. And then I have that tube running into a bucket that I've cleaned out. According to the manual, if we can recover the coolant without contaminating it, we can reuse that coolant into the engine, pending the coolant is still in good condition. So we'll check this at some point down the road. And I am going to very gently blow some compressed air down that reservoir to help push through any residual coolant that might be sitting in those lines. And then I will close that petcock and remove my line. And then I'll also replace that reservoir cap. Now we did remove about 4.5 quarts of coolant. We'll keep this in mind towards the end of the repair when we have to refill the cooling system. And if we take a look at the engine bay, we want to locate the air cleaner outlet pipe. This is a Y pipe that goes to both the passenger side and driver side turbos. And we can see that where this Y's off, we have a clamp. And this clamp has an 8mm fastener. Now this pipe is our right-hand air cleaner pipe to turbocharger pipe. And if we follow that pipe down through the passenger side wheel well, we can see where that comes into our turbo area. We also have a curvy pipe coming off of that. This is our right-hand turbocharger bypass hose. And I'm going to remove that bypass hose first. If we follow the right-hand air cleaner pipe to turbocharger pipe, we do come across a retaining stud. And if we continue to follow that pipe down into the turbocharger, we do see a clamp that is very inaccessible. We can then shift our focus to the right-hand turbocharger to charge air cooler pipe. If we can get this one out of the way, then we can get the other one out of the way. And this pipe also has a worm clamp. If we follow this pipe, we also have another post that we need to remove. And then we can try to work that inlet side off. Now, as we remove this, we do want to note one air line that came off when we remove this. We'll need to remember this for reinstallation. Shifting our focus back to the passenger side, we want to locate our turbo assembly. That turbo assembly looks like a kind of rounded, bubbled out piece of metal. We are wanting to identify our down pipe. This is essentially the exhaust that is connected to our turbo. More specifically, this connects to our right-hand catalytic converter. Taking a look underneath the vehicle, we have our Y pipe for our exhaust system. That then is ran into the passenger side turbo as well as the driver's side turbo. We are looking at the connection point between this exhaust system pipe on the passenger side and the turbo. And this connection point does have two studs with nuts on them holding that on. Because this is an exhaust system, we will want to coat this with Amsoil metal protector to help remove those fasteners. And that fastener on the backside does need to be accessed from underneath the vehicle. And our bracket is loose, but it does get caught on our sensor. Taking a look again from the passenger side of the vehicle, we want to locate the wastegate tube. This is a rubber hose that is connected to a cylindrical type metal piece. We want to work that off. Taking a look at our assembly, we're going to locate our coolant line. And if we follow that coolant line, it does lead to a fitting. Now this fitting does have a C-clip that needs to be removed first. Using a pick or very small screwdriver, we can work that C-clip off of the coolant fitting. We then need to work the coolant line free. We want to be very gentle and use light persuasion. You will want a drip pan because the remaining coolant will drain out. Our next objective is to move the starter out of the way so we can get access to two additional bolts. And if we take a look on the bottom portion of our turbo assembly, we can see one of the bolts. And if we take a look underneath, we can see both of those bolts. And if we look at the back side of that starter from underneath the vehicle, there are two bolt locations. These fasteners are holding that starter in place. Now on that starter, we have two electrical connections on one side of the starter. On the other side, we have our two mounting bolts, one of which has a wire connected to it. Now I did decide to completely remove the starter. This provided me just a little bit of extra space, as it is very difficult to remove some of these components. We then have a little bit better access to those oil lines. There are two T40 bolts holding that in. When those are removed, that oil line assembly is just a little bit loose. And then located at the very back, right near those oil lines, we do have another coolant line. This has a C-clip and is removed the exact same way as the previous coolant line we took off. And then we have one additional bolt. This is a bolt that goes through the mounting bracket for this turbo assembly, and this is also on the back side.
And we can then shift our focus back to the front side and locate the 3 mounting bolts visible from the front.
And it would be worth coating these in Amsoil metal protector to aid in the removal process. And that one was not tight at all. That one was not very tight either.
And we have just a couple additional points to remove, and then we should be loose. We then have a bypass vacuum hose, as well as the turbocharger bypass valve electrical connector. And we can work that turbocharger out. And we're at the point where we can inspect this. Now, if we count our bolts, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8.
Now we lucked out in that the back bolt is not broke. Typically this is the bolt that breaks. We will use Amsoil metal protector to coat all of these bolts and aid in the removal process.
Using a variety of 3/8 inch ratchet and socket extensions and other items, we can loosen up all of the nuts on the stud bolts. Now some of the nuts might just come off and some of the nut and bolt might come off. The goal is to loosen up all of these and remove that exhaust manifold. With the exhaust manifold gone, we can work the gasket off of the stud bolts and remove that gasket from the engine bay as well. And then lastly, we are using the double nut method to remove any remaining studs that are left in the engine bay. This process will take quite a while.
And we will want to use some acetone to clean the mating surface from that exhaust manifold to the engine block. If I compare my components, the old manifold on the passenger side is about 6 pounds 4 ounces. The new one is about 6 pounds 11 ounces. So there is some additional metal. And taking a look at our bolt locations, the original one has 8 bolts, whereas our new one has 11 bolts. And gasket wise, they look about the same. Next, I wanted to identify some components on the turbo. Now, as we see this vantage point, this is what we see on the vehicle. The lowermost tube on the right is our right hand, meaning it is on the passenger side of the vehicle. Our right hand air cleaner pipe to turbocharger pipe.
So this goes from the turbocharger into our pipe, through the Y pipe, and into the airbox.
The next larger tube up is our right hand turbocharger to CAC pipe. The CAC pipe is the charge air cooler, and this pipe will go into our cooling unit. And then that third tube towards the top is our right hand turbocharger bypass hose. Now this one does loop back around and connect into our right hand air cleaner pipe to turbocharger pipe. Now the opening to the bottom left that has 2 stud bolts, this is our exhaust flange. This is what connects up to our exhaust system and that catalytic converter. Now right towards the center, we do see a coolant line.
And that coolant line does run from the turbo to the back of the engine.
And towards the upper left, we can see 3 mounting bolt locations. And then towards the top, we have a turbocharger wastegate tube.
and our wastegate canister. And then if we flip it around, we can see those 3 bolt hole locations. Additionally, we have 1 additional location where we had a mounting bolt. This one was hidden up back behind there. We have our coolant line at the rear, which you cannot see from the front. We can see that first coolant line from the back. We have our wastegate, where our wastegate tube hooks onto. We do have a gasket that we will want to replace. And then if we flip it over to the bottom, and taking a look at the bottom, we can see the location that the oil lines came in at. This also has a gasket on it that we will end up replacing. And those had 2 fasteners on them. If we remove the heat insulating wrap, we can see the bypass vacuum hose as well as the turbocharger bypass valve electrical connector. We're going to begin reassembly by installing the new studs. We are putting the shorter thread end into the cylinder head first. On the passenger side, we want to start with the front lower stud, and we have to use the double nut method to install that in place. These are tightened to 8.8 foot-pounds. And we can work our way through installing these one at a time, making sure to torque those to 8.8 foot-pounds. We can then work that new gasket into place, making sure it gets seated correctly, and we can do a visual inspection, and everything's looking good so far. We can then install our new exhaust manifold onto our new studs, and we're going to start a spacer and manifold nut just by hand, a few turns to make sure that we don't get this cross-threaded, and we can just work around to each of these new stud bolts and get those in place. We're looking pretty good so far. With all of the manifold nuts in place, we need to tighten these in a 3-step sequence. First to 14 foot-pounds, then to 18 foot-pounds, and then double check it at 18 foot-pounds. Now we also have a sequence for all 11 manifold nuts. This will ensure that the torque is evenly applied to the opposing manifold nuts. It is also worth noting that every time you put an extension or universal joint on your ratchet or torque wrench, it will skew the torque specifications of the wrench setting. We are going to do just a little bit of prep work before installing the turbo back onto the vehicle. We're first going to switch out the turbocharger gasket to turbo mounting flange. We're also going to be switching out the gasket for our oil line connection. And then I'll also be switching out those 2 coolant fittings. And these get torqued to 13 foot-pounds. And if installing a new exhaust flange gasket, now would be the time to do that as well. I went ahead and installed my new oil line gasket with the bolts, just a couple threads, and I'm using just a little bit of grease to help these coolant lines install easier. And we're going to add just a little bit of oil into those oil lines just to aid in the initial startup after we complete the repair. And we can then position that in place on the vehicle, trying to line up everything as best as we can. And at this point, we will install our 3 mounting bolts. We have our 2 coolant lines that we need to work into those fittings. We have 2 bolts for our oil lines. We have that mounting bolt on the back side. And then we have our exhaust flange. We then have our electrical connection, followed by that bypass tube. We have our wastegate tube next. And we can work back in that right-hand air cleaner pipe to turbocharger pipe. And then that larger bypass hose, both sides of that. We can then install the starter back onto the vehicle and tighten up any remaining connections or clamps. And with that starter reinstalled, we can reconnect our negative battery terminal. At this point, I have everything reinstalled except for the wheel well covers and the tires, of course. I'm going to refill the cooling system and do a visual inspection for leaks. If all is good, I can start the vehicle and again check everything for leaks. And when we first start it, there might be a light amount of smoke as we have sprayed chemicals on this, put grease on this, and we do have new components that need to run through the heat cycle. Now, as we wrap this repair up, I do recommend doing an oil change. I do recommend doing a coolant flush because we have effectively exposed both of those systems. I also recommend cleaning your braking system as you probably touched the rotor and other components. And aside from that, we can install that wheel well, put the tire back on, and take it for a test drive.